Hi there, my name is Yasmin and I'm a tutor here at Tutor Impact. And today I'm going to be talking to you about mitosis and the cell cycle. Now, this topic is a frequently features in most biology syllabuses. So it's quite an important topic for you to get your head around. But don't worry if you don't know anything about it, because I'm going to go back to the beginning and explain all of the processes from the start. Now, if you don't know much about cells already, I believe another one of the tutors has already made a video on the structure of cells and with all the sort of details about the internal features of a cell. And I'd really recommend you going and watching that video first before watching this video today. But moving on, we're first going to look at chromosomes and DNA. So a DNA is effectively where all the information of the cell is kept. So it contains all of that really important information that the cell needs. And DNA exists in a cell's nucleus within structures called chromosomes. And you can see chromosomes on this diagram here. So we have a chromosome here in this first stage. And each section of this chromosome actually codes for a specific type of protein. And each little section that codes for a different protein is called a gene. So the chromosome itself is split into different genes and they can be found on the chromosome. And today we're going to be looking at mitosis, which I mentioned before. And what mitosis does is it ensures that when a cell divides, the new cell that is produced has the same genetic information. So mitosis ensures that the new cell has the same genetic information as that first cell. Now, as you can see on this diagram, we have one chromosome, and this is made up of a single molecule of DNA. But when the cell is ready to divide, the DNA needs to copy itself. It then coils and condenses to form the chromosomes that we can see in this second picture here. So you can see here that we go from having one chromosome to two chromosomes, which then coil and condense to form this third stage here. Now, each body contains 46 chromosomes, and these are usually arranged in 23 pairs. So all of these chromosomes need to replicate before mitosis can happen, before the cell can replicate. Now, we're going to go into much more detail about this later on, so don't worry if you don't understand it at this stage. So next thing we'll be discussing, obviously, are the cell cycle and mitosis. We mentioned both of these concepts at the beginning. So what are they? The cell cycle is actually a series of steps that the cell has to undergo in order to divide. However, mitosis is actually just one of the many steps in this cycle, and it's the stage where the cell actually divides. But mitosis is often used as sort of a blanket term to reflect the whole process of a cell, the cell's genetic information replicating and then dividing, as we will see later on. So the cell cycle is actually the whole life cycle of the cell when they are undergoing division. And mitosis is just a step in that cycle, and it's the stage where the cell divides. So next, we're going to be looking at why mitosis is so important. Now, cell division by mitosis in multicellular organisms is really important for growth and development and for when you're replacing damaged cells. So if you fall over and you cut your knee, for example, and you damage a load of cells in your knee, you're going to want the cells with the same genetic material to be replacing those cells in your knee. However, mitosis is also a vital part of asexual reproduction, as this type of reproduction only involves one organism. So to produce offspring, it simply replicates its own cells. So this is why mitosis in this instance is important, because you're going to want the same genetic material in these offspring. Now, going back to the cell cycle, there are three main stages in the cell cycle. And the first one of these is what we call interphase. The second stage, which we've mentioned previously, is mitosis. And the final stage is called cytokinesis. Now we're going to go through each one of these in turn and discuss what happens at each individual one of these stages. So you can see this diagram here sort of outlines the process, and I'm going to speak through this as it can look a bit confusing to begin with. So at the beginning, we have the cell beginning to divide. So you can see that's in this first picture here. And this is the first stage in the cell cycle process. So this is actually interphase. So you know how we said there's 3 stages before. This is actually interphase. And what happens at this stage is the cell grows in size. Organelles such as the ribosome and the mitochondria, they grow and they increase in number. The synthesis of proteins also occurs, and DNA is replicated, forming this characteristic X shape. So you can see in this second diagram here that the chromosomes have replicated because we've gone from having one to having pairs in their characteristic X shape. So you can see here we are very clearly in interphase at the beginning of this diagram. So this first stage is interphase. And then from the third picture onwards, we then enter into mitosis. So this is where mitosis is where the chromosomes, so the pairs of X's, the chromosomes line up on the equator of the cell, so just the middle of the cell. And the cell fibers then pull each chromosome in the X formation. So each one, they pull them apart to either side of the cell. And you can start to see this happening in the fourth picture here. So this diagram also adds that the nuclear membrane breaks down in mitosis. And as I said, the chromosomes line up across the center of the cell, so across that equator. And then each set of chromosomes is pulled to each end of the cell, and the nucleus then divides. So this is the stage where the chromosomes line up and they begin to get pulled apart. And then the final stage of this cycle is cytokinesis. And this is where the last stage of the process, this is where the cytoplasm and the cell membrane divide into 2 identical daughter cells. And as I said, the cytoplasm and the membrane divide. And the result is that we have 2 cells left, which are genetically identical. So this is why it's so important that the genetic material replicates, because the end product, we then have 2 identical daughter cells from the process. So just to recap that process again, we start with interphase, which is the first 2 pictures in this diagram. And this is where the cell begins the process of mitosis. And this is where the cell begins to divide. The DNA is replicated and you have 2 copies of each chromosome. We then begin to see mitosis in the second pair of diagrams here. This is where the cell membrane begins to bring down and the chromosomes line up on that equator we spoke about before. And then the chromosomes are pulled apart by cell fibers to either side of the cell before we enter the last stage of cytokinesis, which is where the cytoplasm and the cell membrane break down and we have 2 identical daughter cells left. And that is the whole process of mitosis, or the cell cycle, as it's usually called. Now, moving on, we're going to look at how we calculate the length of time in each one of these phases. So we're going to look at how long a cell is in interphase, how long a cell is in mitosis, and we are going to work this out. So when you're looking in a microscope, you might be asked to use to make observations of how many cells are in each stage, and then you might get asked to estimate how long each stage of the cell cycle actually lasts. And to help with this, we have this helpful formula. And this is quite simple. It's the number of cells observed at that stage. So the number of cells you see in, say, interphase divided by the total number of cells in that sample, and you times that by the total length of the cell cycle, which will usually be given to you. So we're actually going to practice calculating one of these calculations now. So maybe grab a calculator to help you with this, and a piece of paper, because you're going to be working out a length of time in a certain phase in the next slide. So we're going to be looking at this table here, and the cells in this question are from a root tip of a celery plant, and they were observed under a microscope. And the number of cells at the different stage were then counted, and they have been recorded in this table for you here. So we have the number of non-dividing cells, we have stage 1, which is interphase, we have stage 2, which is mitosis, and we have stage 3, which is cytokinesis. So all of these stages have been observed in the cells in this particular sample. You're told that the complete cell cycle takes 15 hours in a celery root tip cell. So what you need to do now is you need to calculate the length of time that stage 1 lasts in a celery root tip cell in this particular sample. So what you need to do is you need to use this formula to work out the answer to this question. Now I'm going to give you 1 minute, I think, or potentially 45 seconds, 1 minute, 45 seconds to try and come up with an answer to this question. So use the formula below, and at the end of the time, we will go through the calculation. So your time starts now. Have a go. Okay, you're just over halfway. Okay, so your time is now up. Don't worry if you don't have an answer yet, because we're going to go through the calculation now. So the answer you should have somehow got to is 233 minutes. Again, don't worry if you didn't get this answer, because we're going to go through it now. So the first thing you do is look at the formula, and we're going to want to work out what each of the numbers we need to put into this formula are. So the first part we need to work out is the observed number of cells at that stage. So we need to look at the observed number of cells at stage 1 in this table. And we can see here that stage 1 had 14 cells in that stage in the sample. So we can note down that there were 14 cells observed in stage 1, which I've written here at the top. The next thing we need to work out is the total number of all cells observed. So that's all of the cells that were observed in the sample. And this is also given for us here. And we can see that there is 54 cells in this sample in total. So in all of the different stages, there are 54 cells. And we do include the non-dividing cells in this number. And then the last thing that we need for our formula is the total length of time of the cell cycle. And again, this is given to us very easily here, where it says that you're told that a complete cell cycle takes 15 hours in celery root tip cells. So we now have these 3 numbers, and what we need to do now is work them out. So what we're going to do first is we're going to calculate the number of cells observed at stage 1 divided by the total number of cells observed in total. So what we need to do is get our calculator, and we need to put in 14, which is the number of cells observed in stage 1, and we're going to divide that by 54. And you'll see that the answer to that is 0.25925, etc. And then we need to times that by 15, as that is the total length of the cell cycle. And you'll see when we times it by 15, you should get 3.88888889. So we're going to round that to 2 decimal places. So we're actually going to round that up to, there's an error in my maths here, we should have rounded that up to 3.89. So it should have been 3.89 here, but don't worry if you got 3.88, I should have just rounded that to 3.89. And to get that into minutes, which your question might ask for, you simply times this by 60 and you will get 233.4. So you actually get the same answer even if you did the rounding incorrectly like I did in this example, but you should get 233 minutes. And that is the length of time that cells in this ciliary root tip are in stage 1. So the answer is 233.4 minutes, or just 233 if you round it down, which you probably would do. So now we've done that, we are going to move on to a recap of what we've looked at today. So first we looked at the cell cycle, which, as I said at the beginning, is a series of steps that the cell has to undergo to divide. And mitosis, as we said, is just a step in this cycle, and it's the stage where the cell divides. So even though the process is commonly referred to as mitosis, mitosis is just a step in this whole cycle of the cell cycle. As we discussed, there are also 2 other stages in this 3-stage process, and we have interphase, where the cell grows and DNA replicates. We have mitosis, which is where the chromosomes line up on that equator, and the cell fibers pull each chromosome of the X to either side of the cell. And then the last stage, as we discussed, is cytokinesis, where 2 identical daughter cells are produced and the cytoplasm and the cell membrane divides between them to produce these 2 separate cells. We've also just finished now with looking at how to calculate the time in each of these stages when looking at cells under a microscope. I hope this video has been helpful for you today, and I hope that it sparks an interest in cell biology, which I personally found really interesting. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you for watching. Bye.